Hey guys, so today I want to see if we can take our sourdough starter and somehow turn that into the most delicious chocolate chip cookie. So I think it is safe to say that sourdough has taken lockdown life by storm. Everybody and their grandmother seems to be making a sourdough starter. And whether you've been following along my old videos from last year or my bake along from Instagram earlier on in the year, so many of you, thousands of you, have been sending me pictures every day of your loaves, and it is the best thing. But if you're not going to make a loaf every day, this thing still stays hungry and needs feeding, which means there's also waste. And one of the biggest questions I've been getting is, what do we do with the waste? Thankfully, we can bake with it. So once your starter is nice and fed, you end up with this. This is your sourdough discarded starter that we're not going to use to make bread. And right now flour is really hard to come by, so this is pretty wasteful. So we can bake with it, but not in the traditional sense. We're not going to use it for its yeasted properties, but just for its flavour, for the extra tang it might give a recipe. Now thankfully, substituting it into another recipe is not that complicated, because if you think about it, a starter is 50% water and 50% flour. So you can easily make that substitution. Say with a pancake recipe, it's very straightforward. You take the starter that you have, you divide it by 2, and you take out that amount of flour and that amount of liquid, and you replace it with our starter. It's fairly straightforward. But with chocolate chip cookies, we have a problem, because cookies don't have any water. Or do they? So the ingredients in a chocolate chip cookie are pretty standard. There's nothing unusual. It's all the usual suspects. Things like flour, sugar, eggs, nothing complicated. And really there's no additional liquid, so we can't just take out a liquid. So how do we get rid of water in a recipe that doesn't seem to contain water? Well, actually, there is 2 elements in this recipe that's actually very easy to eliminate water from. And the first is butter. I hope you forgive me for a second as I get a little bit nerdy, but this is very simple to understand and it does help, so bear with me. European style butter, which is a standard ingredient, includes about 82% butter, fat. And that's fairly standard across Europe. Some are a little bit higher, but generally 82% is the standard. The rest of it, that 18% extra, is water. And it's really easy to eliminate that through browning. So we're going to brown the butter, which also makes it extra delicious, so it's well worth doing. So if this is 225 grams of unsalted butter, and we want to eliminate 18% of it, when we brown it, we're aiming to have 185 grams of butter remaining. And that means it's all fat, no water. And that loss, that 18% loss, can be replaced with sourdough starter. So we're gonna put 225 grams of butter into our pan. We're gonna brown it, and then we're gonna see how much we have left at the end of it. So for those of you who have never browned butter before, what we're going to do is we're going to place the butter over a medium or so heat in a pan, and we're going to cook it until you start to see nice caramelization in the butter. You'll see these little brown bits, and the butter has taken on a nutty flavour and a slightly brown colour. You'll also be able to hear it as we go along. Okay, so now that our butter is melted, you can see it's going to start to foam, and if you listen, that bubbling noise, which is not as normal as kind of bubbling water, is actually the water from the butter trying to escape and evaporating away, and that's why it has that kind of like popping noise, because it's fat and water together. So what we're going to do is keep it going until these white pieces that are on the surface sink to the bottom and then caramelize, and by that point, once the bubbling has stopped, this kind of fast, aggressive bubbling, we should have cooked off all the water. So whilst the first ingredient you might have guessed included water, the second ingredient, I'd hazard a guess, is not the first thing that will jump to mind. And that's because it's the eggs. Now the egg white in this is what includes water. 90% of an egg white is water. So just by eliminating the egg white, that helps us to get more water to play around with. Now from years and years and thousands upon thousands of macarons made, I can tell you that a UK size large egg is basically 40 grams worth of egg white. So 2 of those in this recipe means we have 80 grams worth of liquid removed from our recipe. And plus the 40 grams of water weight we lost in the butter, that means we have a total of 120 grams to play with. Now that doesn't mean we can just add 120 grams of starter, because remember, a starter is 50% flour and 50% water. So that actually means we can add 240 grams of starter, but it also means we have to remove half of that as flour. So 120 grams of flour from the recipe also has to be removed. I know this is sounding super complicated, but I've done the math. You don't have to. Follow the recipe. You're gonna brown the butter, you're gonna remove your egg whites. Super simple, I promise. Also, you might be wondering why I'm not using the cookie recipe I developed during the Cookie Chronicles last year. And the reason for that is that recipe already used brown butter, so it was harder to eliminate water from that recipe without making more complicated changes. So what I'm actually using is this recipe. It's from my first book, which you can tell was a very long time ago. And the reason for that is it's a recipe I know inside out, and it's also a classic recipe that uses creamed butter and sugar. So it was easier to find the water to eliminate.
And talking about good timing, look what's just arrived. Well, look at the name of what's just arrived.
So this is from Pump Street Chocolate. They are a bakery and chocolate company down in a tiny village. And I'm talking literally tiny. There's a bakery, a church, a restaurant, a hotel, a pub. I think that's it. It's so small. It's on the coast in a place called Orford. And they are a small bakery with a very big reputation, and their chocolate company is even bigger. Their chocolate is incredible. So this is something really fun, and I cannot wait to put it in this recipe. So to make the actual cookie is really straightforward. All we're gonna do is take our ever so slightly cooled brown butter, add that to our mixer. Now obviously we can't cream this, beat the butter and sugar together because it's liquid. So all we're gonna do is just whisk everything to combine just briefly. Now obviously that doesn't really do much, we just want to bring everything together. Then we're gonna add our egg yolks, and that should help bring everything into a slightly smoother mix. So we're gonna add our egg yolks. I'm adding just one extra just to help make the mixture a little bit more fudgy. We're just gonna whisk that again to combine. So after a couple of minutes whisking, it will look a little bit gross. It might look like it's kind of split, it will look a bit wet. And we are adding a little bit of air, but our main function of doing this whisking is just to break up any lumps of sugar and just make sure everything is nicely combined. Now at this stage, we need to weigh in our discard. So we're gonna use 240 grams, and we're just gonna add that straight to our bowl. At this stage, I'm also just gonna add about a teaspoon of vanilla extract. And we're just gonna whisk it to combine. I'm using the whisk because it will combine easier than using the paddle. It'll be a lot quicker. So you can already see just after a minute of mixing, it already looks a little bit more like a cookie dough. So all we need to do now is add our remaining dry ingredients. So to this, we're gonna add our flour, salt, baking powder, and baking soda, remembering that we've already removed our excess flour, our 120 grams, that is in the starter. So at this stage, I'm just gonna pulse just on short bursts, just until everything is hydrated. And once the dough just starts to come together, like that, we're gonna take our chocolate, which we have nicely chopped, and we're just gonna add that to the bowl. And again, mix that just until it's combined. And that is our finished sourdough chocolate chip cookie dough. So once our cookie dough is made, Whilst we could bake this now, it is better if we refrigerate it for at least 4 hours. It will control the spread and it will just make a better textured cookie. Now, because we have added sourdough starter, the dough will continue to ferment, so depending on how long you leave it will depend on the flavour of the end cookie. I like to bake them after about 4 hours, but they will develop more and more of that sour tang the longer you leave them. So if you leave them for 24 hours, you'll get more of that tang, but it'll be even more delicious. After about 4 hours or so, our cookie dough is really nice and firm. So all we're going to do is roll that into balls and bake them. So I like to do 70-gram sized balls, and that just means you get a good sized cookie. You can do this by eye, kind of rolling them to kind of golf ball sized pieces, but I like to weigh them so they're all exactly the same size and they all bake at the same time. So all we're going to do is just cut some of the dough with a spoon, just scoop it out and then roll it into a ball. If the dough gets super soft during this stage and gets really warm, you can throw it back in the fridge, but we shouldn't need to. We should be able to bake them straight away. Now to finish the cookies, I'm going to sprinkle them with a little bit of flaked sea salt. Obviously you can leave that off, but because we're adding that sourdough starter, that discard, I find it adds a bit more tang, and salt really helps to balance everything out, to balance the sweetness and just bring out all those flavours. Now I'm going to put them in the oven for about 16 to 18 minutes in an oven that's been preheated to 350 degrees, so 180 or 160 on a fan oven. We just want to bake them until they're nice and golden around the outside. So after 16 to 18 minutes, this is what you get. The most delicious looking chocolate chip cookies. They look super classic, but inside them lies a little secret, and that is tang and deliciousness from the sourdough starter. Puddles of chocolate, so delicious and just perfect. I cannot tell you how good they are, and it is such a good use of the sourdough discard. It uses a couple of days worth of discard. It's a really easy recipe to do, and once you learn how to do it, it really teaches you how to swap out that discard in other recipes, so it's well worth playing around with. I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, the recipe is linked up in the corner or down in the description box below. Make sure you are subscribed because I'll be making new baking videos every single week, including next weekend a sourdough pizza recipe that is so delicious. So leave me a comment down below of what your favourite topping would be for a sourdough pizza. Until next week, I will see you later.